Hi, ladies. This week we're going to be talking about the Gospel according to John. And I think it takes just one chapter of looking at John's Gospel to recognize that it's completely different than the Synoptic Gospels. It has a whole different sense to it. It's very poetic. It's beautifully written, but it also takes a little unraveling to understand what it's saying, which most theologians really like. And in your book, there's a quote that I really liked that said basically, the other Gospels set out to tell the story of Jesus, and John's Gospel set out to be a spiritual gospel. And so, again, it is pretty different. So, like the other videos, I will just highlight some things about John's Gospel that I want you to know, and of course, the chapter will go into more detail. So, first of all, the big question mark is the author. The Gospel itself never indicates directly who the author is, although there's an indication at the end of the Gospel in chapter 21 that basically says the person who's testifying to all of this is the one who sat next to Jesus at the Last Supper and is the beloved disciple. And most people have historically believed that John was the one who sat next to Jesus and that he was the beloved apostle. At the same time, at an earlier point in this same gospel, in chapter 11, when it tells the story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, it also refers to Lazarus as the beloved. So it's kind of up in the air as far as who wrote this gospel. Historically and traditionally, people have attributed it to John the Apostle and believed that he also wrote 3 letters and the book of Revelation, although some theories say that it was a later John who lived in Ephesus who wrote some of the other works. But for the sake of ease, your book is going to talk about it all as one author, and I also will do the same. Again, when we talk about these authors, we're more talking about them as evangelists. John himself was one of the core apostles. He was kind of in this core group with his brother James and Peter, and they were at all the big events, which your book will also kind of highlight for you. Jesus called John and James the sons of thunder, and they were a big part in the gospel, would have been present at all of the big moments. And according to legend, John the Apostle did live a lot longer than the other apostles, and there's no record of his martyrdom. So people think it's possible he did live out his life in Ephesus. And according to what most people believe, he was imprisoned for a couple of years on the island of Patmos, but then went to live in Ephesus. As far as the source, some of the other basic information, this was the last gospel written between 90 and 100 AD. Again, it's much more of a spiritual gospel, and there are so many things that are different about it. Most people believe it was written in Ephesus, because that's, again, by legend, where John lived out the end of his life, or Palestine. At this point, the audience is all people. It's written to everyone, and the portrait of Jesus is of a life-giving Savior. And it presents a very high Christology. I think I mentioned this on a last, one of the past videos, but a low Christology would be one that focuses more on the humanity of Jesus, where a high Christology focuses more on the divinity of Jesus. And one example of that in this gospel is when you get to the crucifixion, of Jesus. It doesn't really show him experiencing physical pain, but it's more like he's a king on a throne, like he's more divine than human. As far as the sources go, we do think that this author would have had access to the Synoptic Gospels and was familiar with them, and also had a unique passion narrative and a signs source. A sign source would have been a list of miracles, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. Of course, whoever this was, had access to the Synoptic Gospels, but chose to do something completely different, as I think most of us would if there were already 3 accounts of the same thing. We would only add a 4th account if we had a different perspective to offer that account. As far as the gospel, 90% of it is unique. It is very different, again, to the other gospels. In a few minutes, I'll talk about kind of the things that it doesn't include that would have been in the Synoptic Gospels. So some of those differences are there's no record of the virginal birth. There's no record of Jesus' baptism, although it is alluded to. There's no information about the temptation in the desert, which the other Gospels all mention. There's no exorcisms, which again is expelling demons. This one is the most surprising to me, but there are no parables at all in the Gospel according to John. He never takes time, he never shows Jesus taking time to interpret Mosaic law or what it means to be Jewish. Again, this is written so much later that at this point you're either Jewish or Christian. There's no, kind of person who sees themselves as both. There's no mention of the Parousia, which is the second coming of Jesus. It doesn't say anything about that. And John's gospel doesn't show Jesus breaking the bread at the Last Supper and instituting the Eucharist. Instead, at John's gospel, it shows Jesus washing the disciples' feet and kind of expressing that he came to serve and not to be served. The gospel itself is divided into two main sections, the book of signs and the book of glory. The book of signs outlines 7 miracles that Jesus performed, and this number 7 is significant. 7 always symbolizes perfection or completion. And if this was written by the same person who wrote the book of Revelation, that number 7 is in there a bunch of times, maybe 777. Just joking. But anyway, the book of glory is the passion narrative, and again, it shows Jesus on the cross like he is a king in all his glory. Another thing that's kind of interesting is that Jesus is referred to as Logos in Greek, which means the Word. And it says the Word was with God and is God. The Word became flesh. The world helped create the world. The Word was there at the beginning of creation. So that is kind of unique in this gospel. Also, there are in this gospel 7 I am statements. Again, the number 7 means completion or perfection. And there's many discourses. A discourse is like a speech. So usually when these I am statements are used, Jesus gives a little speech about his purpose here on earth and his ultimate reality as human and divine. So I hope you enjoy reading about John's Gospel. Again, it's quite unique. And this week you do have a discussion to also participate in. And then, of course, next week will be the midterm. Talk to you later.